There was a Tuesday, an ordinary one, nothing about the light or the weather marked it as different, when you said no to something and you didn't explain why. You didn't rehearse the sentence in your head 3 times before saying it. You didn't watch the other person's face to see if they approved. You just said it, and then you kept walking, kept living, kept breathing the same way you had 5 minutes before. And somewhere in the quiet after that, you noticed something had shifted. Not loudly, not with fireworks, just a small, settled feeling, like a held breath finally let go. You didn't need them to agree with you anymore. Not your mother's voice, not a spouse's raised eyebrow, not the neighbor who always had an opinion, not even the version of yourself from 30 years ago who needed every single person in the room to nod before she believed she was right. Something in you had quietly stopped asking permission. And if you're honest, you're still not sure exactly when it happened. But you know it did. And today we're going to talk about that moment, and about everything it took to get there. This is a video about the approval you spent most of your life chasing, and the peace that shows up the moment you stop. We're going to walk through 9 reasons why you don't need it anymore. Not as a lecture, not as someone telling you how to feel, but as an honest look at what happens in a person's heart after decades of performing, adjusting, softening, explaining, and then slowly stopping. Some of these reasons might feel like they were written specifically about your life. Others might surprise you. Stay with me through all of them, because by the end, I think you'll understand something about yourself that maybe no one ever said out loud to you before. This isn't about becoming a harder version of yourself, or a colder one, or someone who stops caring what the people they love think or feel. It's almost the opposite of that. It's about finally being able to tell the difference between the people whose opinions genuinely matter to you because you love them, and the vague, faceless sense of obligation you've been carrying toward everyone else, the neighbors, the extended family, the acquaintances, the version of society that seems to be watching and grading you even when, if you're honest, it probably stopped paying attention a long time ago. That difference changes everything about how the rest of your life can feel. So let's start with that moment itself, because it matters more than you might think. Think about the last time you caught yourself softening an opinion before you even said it out loud. The last time you laughed a little too quickly at something that wasn't funny, just to keep the room comfortable. The last time you agreed with someone while a completely different sentence sat quietly in your chest, unsent. You know that feeling. Almost everyone does. For most of your life, that instinct wasn't weakness. It was strategy. It kept the peace at the dinner table when you were young and dependent on the people around it. It kept your job secure when a raised eyebrow from a supervisor could change your whole month. It kept a marriage steady on the nights when disagreement felt more dangerous than silence. You learned, the way almost everyone learns, that approval wasn't just nice to have. It was the price of belonging. So you paid it, quietly, consistently, for years, maybe for decades. You paid it in small ways. The opinions you didn't share, the outfit you changed because someone raised an eyebrow, the career path you adjusted because it made someone else proud instead of making you curious. And you paid it in bigger ways too. Relationships you stayed in longer than you wanted to, decisions you let other people make for you because their comfort felt more urgent than your own truth. None of that makes you weak. It makes you someone who understood correctly that human beings need each other to survive. That instinct is ancient. It's older than language. For most of human history, being cast out of the group didn't just mean loneliness. It meant danger, sometimes it meant death. Your nervous system doesn't know the difference between a modern disagreement and an ancient threat to your survival. It reacts the same way. It says, smooth this over, keep them close, don't be the reason the group turns away from you. So when you spent years chasing approval, you weren't chasing vanity. You were chasing safety the way any living thing does. Think about how many rooms you walked into over the years already bracing yourself before anyone said a word. A holiday dinner where you knew exactly which topics to avoid. A doctor's office where you nodded along instead of asking the question that actually worried you, because the doctor seemed busy and you didn't want to be difficult. A meeting where you agreed with a plan you privately thought was a mistake, because disagreeing out loud felt riskier than staying quiet and hoping it would work out anyway. None of these moments felt dramatic while they were happening. That's exactly what made them so effective at shaping you. Small, constant, almost invisible adjustments, repeated across thousands of ordinary days, until bracing yourself for other people's reactions became as automatic as breathing. You probably couldn't even count how many opinions you swallowed over the decades, how many times you chose the version of yourself that was easiest for someone else to be around instead of the version that was actually true. And the strange thing is, most of those adjustments felt like kindness at the time. They felt like consideration, like good manners, like simply being a decent person who didn't make things harder for everyone else. In some ways, they were. But somewhere underneath all that consideration, a quieter cost was accumulating too. One you may not have added up until much later in life, when you finally stopped to ask yourself how much of your own voice you'd spent keeping other people comfortable. But here's what's different now, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. The dinner table you needed to keep peaceful has changed, or it's gone. The supervisor whose eyebrow controlled your month has been replaced by a life where your income doesn't hang on someone else's mood. Some of the people whose approval mattered most are no longer here to give or withhold it. And the parts of you that spent so long performing are finally being asked a new question. What do you actually think now that no one's watching to grade the answer? That question is disorienting at first. But it's also the beginning of something. It's the moment the performance starts to end, whether you planned it or not. That's not you losing your manners. That's you finally hearing your own voice again. And once you hear it, even faintly, even just once, it's very hard to go back to pretending you didn't. But hearing your own voice again is one thing. Understanding why it went quiet in the first place is another. Maybe you remember being very young and understanding, without anyone explicitly teaching you, exactly which version of you got a smile and which version got silence or worse. Maybe you remember learning it wasn't safe to be too loud, too certain, too different from what was expected of you. Nobody sits a 5-year-old down and explains social approval as a survival strategy. You don't need the explanation. You feel it immediately and completely, the very first time your face lights up and someone else's doesn't light up back. Children are extraordinary readers of rooms. Long before you could read a book, you could read a mood, and you adjusted instinctively to keep the people who fed you and sheltered you and loved you close and warm toward you. That adjustment becomes a habit. And habits formed early don't just fade away when you grow up. They get quieter, more automatic, more invisible until you stop noticing you're doing them at all. The child who learned to read a parent's face grows into the young adult who reads a boss's face, a partner's face, a friend's silence on the phone. The audience changes. The performance doesn't. You can probably trace the thread if you try. The way you learned to apologize before you'd even finished a sentence. The way you developed a talent for reading tension in a room before anyone said a single word about it. The way you got remarkably good at predicting what someone wanted to hear and delivering exactly that, often faster than you could check in with what you actually believed yourself. That skill served you. It really did. It likely helped you keep a job, keep a marriage functioning, keep a family gathering from falling apart. But skills built for survival don't always know when the danger has passed. They keep running long after the original threat is gone. The same way a smoke detector doesn't know the difference between a house fire and burnt toast. It just goes off. And for years, maybe most of your life, that internal alarm has been going off over things that were never actually threats to your safety, only threats to someone else's comfort, or to an image of yourself you'd built to keep the peace. Understanding that difference, really understanding it, is one of the quiet turning points of getting older. It's the moment you start being able to ask, in the middle of that old familiar anxious feeling, whether this is a real danger or just an old alarm firing out of habit. And here's the part that's easy to miss. You probably didn't choose most of the standards you spent your life trying to meet. Somebody else decided what counted as a good son or daughter, a good provider, a good spouse, a good neighbor, long before you had the ability to question whether those standards actually fit who you were. You simply absorbed them the way children absorb language without conscious decision, just by being immersed in it every single day. So for years, maybe most of your adult life, you were measuring yourself against a rulebook you never actually agreed to write. And every time you fell short of it or thought you did, that old childhood alarm went off again. The one that once meant real danger, now firing over something as small as an unanswered text or a relative's raised eyebrow at a holiday dinner. It's exhausting to live like that, even when you don't notice you're doing it. It's exhausting to carry an invisible audience in your head, scoring every choice you make. And most people carry that audience for decades without ever turning around and asking it a simple question. Who gave you this job? Who decided your opinion of me gets to matter this much? That's not you being paranoid. That's a very old habit doing exactly what it was trained to do. And once you can name the habit, you can finally start to loosen its grip, not all at once, but one quiet decision at a time. Naming the habit is one thing. Naming the actual voices behind it is another, because they were never just abstract. They had faces. Maybe it was a parent's specific tone when they disapproved of something without saying a word. Maybe it was a spouse's sigh, or a friend's offhand comment that stuck with you for 30 years even though they probably forgot they said it by dinner. Whoever it was, you know the voice. You could probably still do the impression. For most of us, it wasn't one voice. It was a chorus, built up over decades, each person adding their own note to the same song. A parent's expectations laid the first layer down, usually before you were even old enough to question it. A spouse added their own version, shaped by what made them comfortable, what made them feel secure, what they needed you to be in order to feel safe themselves. Employers added a professional layer. Be agreeable, don't rock the boat. Smile even when you don't feel like smiling. And underneath all of it sat something even larger and vaguer, the general hum of what a community, a culture, a generation expected from someone like you. You carried all of that. Most people do without ever fully realizing how heavy it's become, the way you don't notice a backpack's weight until you finally set it down. But here's something worth noticing, gently, without rushing past it. Many of those voices have gone quiet on their own, simply because life moved forward. A parent who once had strong opinions about your choices may no longer be here to voice them, or may have softened with their own age and their own reckoning with mortality. A marriage that once required constant management may have ended, or evolved into something calmer. A career that demanded a certain performance from 9 to 5 has likely wound down or stopped altogether. The chorus that used to fill the room has, one voice at a time, gotten smaller. There's also a particular chorus reserved specifically for people your age. One that's easy to underestimate because it doesn't always announce itself loudly. It's the expectation that older people should be pleasant above all else. Undemanding, grateful, easy to be around. Not a bother to their children. Not a burden to their doctors. Not too opinionated at the family table. Not too insistent about their own preferences when someone else has already made a plan. It's a version of approval seeking with a new name, dressed up as graceful aging, and it asks you to keep performing the exact same smallness you've been performing your whole life, just now with the added pressure of gratitude, as if simply being permitted to take up space were itself a favor someone did for you. You didn't necessarily choose to absorb that expectation either. It arrived the way all the others did, quietly, through 1,000 small cultural signals about what a good, easy, low-maintenance older person is supposed to look like. But you're allowed to notice it for what it is. You're allowed to be exactly as demanding of respect, as clear about your preferences, and as unwilling to disappear quietly as you were at 40, or 30, or 20. Age was never supposed to be the price of your voice. It was supposed to be the reward for finally being able to use it. And into that quiet, which can feel strange at first, even a little empty, something else has room to grow. Your own voice, the one that got crowded out for so long, finally has space to be heard without competing against everyone else's expectations. It's not that the old voices were evil or wrong. Most of them came from people who loved you in the only way they knew how. But love and approval are not always the same thing, and it's taken you most of a lifetime to learn how to tell them apart. That's not disloyalty to the people who shaped you. That's simply growing past the need for their permission. The chorus quieted whether you asked it to or not. What you do with that quiet is entirely up to you now. And what most people do with that quiet once they stop being afraid of it is something almost nobody expects. You'd think that letting go of the need for approval would push people away. You'd think that speaking your real mind, setting a real boundary, living according to your real preferences instead of everyone else's, would leave you more alone, not less. It's a reasonable fear. It's just not what actually happens. Here's what tends to happen instead, and it surprises almost everyone who experiences it. When you stop performing agreement you don't feel, some relationships do change. A few might even fall away, the ones that were built entirely on your willingness to bend, to agree, to make yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger or safer or right. Losing those relationships can sting, even when you know somewhere underneath the sting that they weren't giving you very much to begin with. But something else happens at the same time, quieter and easier to miss if you're only focused on what you're losing. The people who stay, the ones who hear your honest opinion and don't flinch, the ones who can handle your real preferences instead of the agreeable version of you, those relationships get stronger. Not weaker, stronger. Because for the first time, they're not relating to a performance. They're relating to you. There's a strange kind of relief in that once you let yourself feel it. You no longer have to wonder whether someone would still like you if they knew what you actually thought. They already know, and they're still here. That's not a small thing. That's actually one of the most stabilizing feelings available to a person, at any age, but especially at this one. The feeling of being fully known and still fully welcome. Most people spend so much of their life terrified that authenticity will cost them their relationships. What almost nobody warns you is that the opposite is usually true. Performance creates relationships that are wide but thin, lots of people, not much depth. Authenticity creates relationships that are fewer sometimes but load-bearing, the kind that can actually hold weight when things get hard, because they were never built on pretending in the first place. Picture two versions of the same conversation. In the first, you disagree with a family member about something that matters to you, and instead of saying so, you go quiet, change the subject, let it pass, and drive home carrying a small stone of resentment that never quite dissolves. In the second, you say what you actually think, plainly and without cruelty, and the conversation gets a little uncomfortable for a moment before it settles into something more honest than it's been in years. Only one of those two conversations actually deepens the relationship. The first one just delays a reckoning, while quietly teaching the other person that the agreeable version of you is the only version they're allowed to see. The second one, even though it's harder in the moment, tells them something valuable. That you trust the relationship enough to bring your real self into it, and that you believe it can survive honesty instead of requiring performance to stay intact. Most relationships that end because of honesty were already hollowed out long before the honest conversation happened. The honesty didn't break them. It just finally revealed what had already been true for a long time. And the relationships that survive honesty, that actually get better because of it, were always sturdier than you gave them credit for. You just never had the chance or the courage to find that out until now. That's not you pushing people away. That's you finally finding out who was really there. And that discovery, once it happens, is very hard to unsee. You start wanting only the relationships that can survive your honesty. There's one more thing that tends to speed all of this along, and it isn't always a gentle teacher. Think about the losses you've already lived through. A parent, maybe a spouse, a friend you assumed would always be on the other end of the phone, or simply your own health in ways it used to be before. Loss has a way of teaching lessons nothing else can. If you're still here with me, if any of this is landing somewhere real, I want you to know this next part matters more than almost anything else in this video, so stay with me for a moment longer. Grief has an odd side effect that almost nobody talks about, maybe because it feels strange to call anything about grief a gift. But it is one. When you lose someone or something that mattered enormously, a spouse of 40 years, a friend who knew every version of you, your own steady health, the experience strips away, almost violently, everything that doesn't actually matter. All the small anxieties you used to carry about what the neighbors thought, whether a sibling approved of your choices, whether you'd said the right thing at dinner, all of that becomes almost laughably small next to the fact that someone you loved is gone, or that your own body has reminded you it won't last forever. Loss has a way of clarifying what was always true but easy to ignore. Time is not infinite, and neither is your patience for spending it on things that don't matter. You start to notice how much of your life was spent managing other people's opinions of you, and how little of that managing actually protected you from anything real. It didn't stop the losses from coming. It didn't make death take a different path. All it did was cost you years of honesty you can't get back. This is where many people, somewhere in their 60s, 70s, and beyond, arrive at a version of the same realization, even if they'd never phrase it this way. I don't have time to keep performing for people who might not even be here next year, and neither do I. That thought isn't morbid. It's clarifying. It's the same clarity that lets a person finally say the hard thing to a sibling, or forgive a debt that was never repaid, or stop attending an event out of obligation and start attending only the ones that actually feed something in them. Loss teaches, sometimes brutally, that approval never kept anyone alive, never made a goodbye easier, never filled a chair that's now empty. What it's teaching you, maybe right now, if you've lived through this, is that honesty is the only currency that actually mattered the whole time. It isn't only the death of a person that teaches this lesson. Sometimes it's a diagnosis that reorganizes your whole sense of time. Sometimes it's retirement, the sudden absence of a role that used to answer the question of who you were every single morning. Sometimes it's simply a birthday that lands differently than the ones before it, a number that makes you do the math on how many good years might realistically be left, and how you actually want to spend them. Whatever the specific loss was for you, it likely did the same basic work. It took the long list of things you used to worry mattered and shortened it ruthlessly down to what actually does. Somewhere in that shortened list, other people's approval tends to drop toward the bottom, if it stays on the list at all. Not because you stopped caring about people. If anything, you probably care more now, more specifically about fewer people with more of yourself. But the general, diffuse need to be liked by everyone, agreed with by everyone, approved of by every relative and acquaintance and half-remembered old friend, that need tends to quietly lose its grip once you've stood close enough to loss to feel how little it actually protects you from. You don't get that clarity for free. You paid for it the hardest way there is. But it's yours now, and it isn't going anywhere. That's not you becoming cold or detached. That's you finally spending your remaining time on what's real. And once grief teaches you that lesson, it stays with you, quietly reordering everything that comes after. But reordering your priorities is one thing. Trusting yourself enough to act on the new order is another, and that's where a very old fear tends to show up. Maybe somewhere along the way, someone called you selfish for finally putting yourself first. Maybe you called yourself that quietly in your own head the first time you said no to something you used to always say yes to. There's a word that gets thrown around a lot whenever someone stops abandoning themselves for other people's comfort. Selfish. It's a heavy word, and for a lot of people, especially those raised to believe that a good person is a self-sacrificing person, it lands like an accusation that sticks. But selfishness and self-respect are not the same thing, even though they can look similar from the outside for a moment. Selfishness takes from other people without regard for their needs. Self-respect simply stops giving away things that were never anyone else's to take in the first place. Your time, your opinions, your right to make your own decisions about your own life. Nobody was entitled to those things just because you'd been generous with them for so long. Think about it honestly. When you said yes to things you didn't want to do, when you agreed with opinions you didn't share, when you shrank yourself to keep someone else comfortable, did that actually make the relationship better? Or did it just build up a quiet resentment underneath a smiling surface? A resentment that eventually leaked out anyway, in small comments or sudden distance or an exhaustion you couldn't quite explain. There's a quiet arithmetic to this that most people never sit down and actually do. Every time you said yes when you meant no, you weren't just losing that single moment. You were teaching the people around you what to expect from you going forward, setting a precedent that made the next yes even harder to avoid. Self-respect breaks that arithmetic. It's not one grand gesture. It's 100 small corrections said plainly without a long apology attached. A preference stated instead of swallowed. A boundary held instead of negotiated away. A simple no that doesn't come wrapped in 3 paragraphs of justification. Each one is small. Together, over months and years, they add up to an entirely different relationship with your own life. One where your judgment is finally allowed to count for something, starting with you. Most people who finally start respecting their own judgment discover something they didn't expect. Their relationships don't get worse. They get more honest. The people around them stop having to guess what they really think because they're finally being told. And strangely, that honesty, even when it includes disagreement, tends to build more trust than decades of agreeable silence ever did. Self-respect isn't the opposite of love. It's what makes love sustainable over the long run, because nobody can keep performing forever without eventually running out of the energy it takes to keep smiling through it. If you were raised, as so many people your age were, to believe that a person's worth was measured by how much of themselves they gave away, or that asking for anything was a kind of weakness to be hidden rather than honored, this particular shift can feel almost like breaking a rule nobody ever wrote down but everyone somehow agreed to. You watched the people who raised you live by that rule. Maybe you watched a parent disappear into everyone else's needs until there was almost nothing left that was recognizably theirs. Maybe you watched someone treat their own exhaustion as something to hide rather than something to honor. You learned, by example, long before you learned it any other way, what a good person was supposed to sacrifice, and how quietly they were supposed to do it. Unlearning that isn't disrespecting the people who taught it to you. Most of them were doing the best they understood how to do, inside rules they didn't write either. But you get to be the one who finally asks whether those rules were ever actually necessary, or whether they were just the water everyone happened to be swimming in. You get to keep the parts of that upbringing that still serve you, the generosity, the loyalty, the care, and quietly set down the parts that only ever cost you yourself. That's not selfishness. That's a debt finally being paid back to yourself. And once you've paid even a little of that debt, you start to understand why you spent so long avoiding the payment. And somewhere in that reclaiming, something even deeper starts to shift. The question of whether anyone actually sees who you really are. Think about the last time someone looked at you, really looked, not at the role you play, not at the version of you that keeps everyone comfortable, but at you, the person underneath all of it. If you can't remember the last time that happened, you're not alone. Most people can't. There's a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone. You can be surrounded by people, a full house at a holiday, a phone that never stops buzzing, and still feel it. The loneliness of being loved for a performance instead of a person. It happens slowly, so slowly you might not notice it happening. You adjust a little here, soften a little there, keep certain thoughts to yourself for so many years that eventually the mask and the face underneath it start to feel like the same thing. You might even have caught yourself, somewhere along the way, forgetting which parts of you were real and which parts were simply well rehearsed. That's how thorough a performance can become, given enough decades to practice it. You laugh at the joke you've heard 100 times because that's what's expected. You give the answer people want about how you're doing, even on the days when the true answer is more complicated than fine. You keep the peace so consistently for so long that peacekeeping starts to feel less like a choice and more like an identity, one you didn't exactly sign up for but somehow became anyway. And underneath all of that consistent, careful management of everyone else's comfort, there's a version of you that hasn't had much room to speak in years. Not a lesser version. Not a more difficult version. Just a truer one, with opinions that are actually yours, reactions that haven't been pre-approved, a way of being in the world that isn't constantly checking itself against an audience. That version of you is still there. It didn't disappear. It's just been waiting, patiently, for the performance to finally end. And then, somewhere in this later chapter of your life, something remarkable starts to happen. As you stop needing approval, you stop needing the mask. Not all at once, nobody drops decades of habit overnight, but piece by piece, in small honest moments, the real face starts to show through again. And what happens next is almost always the same, no matter who it happens to. The people who truly love you don't recoil from what they see. They lean in. They've been waiting, in some cases for years, for the real version of you to finally show up, tired of talking to someone who was always managing the conversation instead of having it. There's an old idea, often attributed to the psychoanalyst Carl Jung, that captures this better than almost anything else. I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. You didn't choose the decades of performing. You were taught them the way most of us are taught to survive whatever room we're born into. But you are choosing this, the honesty, the boundary, the quiet refusal to shrink yourself for someone else's comfort. That choice, made late or made early, is still entirely yours. Being truly seen at this point in your life isn't a small thing. It might be one of the most important things left to experience. And it's only possible once you stop performing for an audience that was never really watching as closely as you feared. That's not vanity wanting to be truly seen. That's one of the most human needs there is. And the almost unbelievable truth is that it's still available to you, right now, at this exact age, in this exact life. Knowing that it's still available naturally raises a quieter question, one you might ask yourself in the mirror sometimes. If you could sit down across from the person you were 40, 30, even 20 years ago, nervous, eager to please, terrified of disappointing someone, what would you actually say to them? Most people, when they really sit with that question, don't reach for anger. They reach for something softer, a kind of tenderness for the person they used to be, someone who was doing the very best they could with the tools and the fears they'd been given. You'd probably tell that younger version of yourself that most of what felt so urgent back then, the disapproving look, the awkward silence after a disagreement, the fear of being talked about, barely left a mark on the actual shape of your life. The things you were so afraid of rarely turned out to be the things that mattered. You might tell them that the marriage or the friendship or the job they stayed in out of fear of disappointing someone wasn't actually protecting them from anything. It was just delaying a conversation they eventually had to have anyway, usually with more pain attached the longer they waited. You might tell them that the people whose approval felt like oxygen at the time have, in most cases, moved on with their own lives, their own worries, barely thinking about the disagreement that once kept them up at night. You might also tell that younger version of yourself something simpler, something almost embarrassingly basic, and yet something that took you decades to actually believe. That being disliked by someone is survivable. Not comfortable, not painless, but survivable in a way your younger self, wired for belonging above almost everything else, could not have imagined at the time. You'd tell them that the sky did not fall the handful of times you finally did disappoint someone on purpose, that the relationships worth keeping did not evaporate, that the world kept turning at exactly the same speed it always had. You'd tell them that most people are far too preoccupied with managing their own approval to spend as much time judging yours as you always assumed they were. That single realization, if it had arrived 40 years earlier, might have changed the shape of an entire life. It didn't arrive then. It's arriving now. And while there's no way to hand that knowledge backward in time to the person who needed it most, there is a way to use it forward, starting today, for however many years are left to spend it on the parts of your life that are still being written. There's a particular kind of grief in realizing how much time went into managing other people's opinions of you, time you can't get back, energy you can't refund. But there's also something freeing in it if you let there be. You're not that frightened younger person anymore. You've lived long enough to see how most of those fears played out, and the answer almost every time is that you would have been fine. Better than fine, most likely, if you'd trusted yourself sooner. That's not a reason for regret. That's a reason for relief because you get to use everything you learned starting exactly now, today, with whatever years are still ahead of you. That's not wasted time. That's simply the price of learning something most people never learn at all. And what you do with that lesson now is worth infinitely more than any amount of time you spent learning it. And that's really the last piece of this, because what you do with it doesn't only affect you. Think about the people who are watching you now. A daughter, a grandson, a neighbor's kid who's noticed how you carry yourself. They're learning something from you whether you're trying to teach it or not. There's a kind of teaching that has nothing to do with words. It happens simply by being watched, by someone younger noticing how you handle a disagreement, how you set a boundary without apologizing 11 times first, how you say what you actually think at a family dinner instead of the safe, agreeable version everyone expects. Children and grandchildren absorb far more from what they see modeled than from what they're told directly. You could give 100 speeches about self-respect, and none of them would teach as much as one dinner where they watch you calmly, kindly, refuse to shrink yourself for someone else's comfort. This matters more than it might seem, especially now. So many people your age spend the second half of life still performing for approval, still managing everyone's feelings but their own, and the people around them absorb that as the norm, as simply what getting older looks like. But you have the chance to model something different. You have the chance to show a granddaughter that a woman in her 70s can say no without guilt. You have the chance to show a son that a father can admit he was wrong without it costing him his authority. You have the chance to show whoever's watching that freedom from approval isn't just possible, it's available at any age, the moment you decide to stop paying for something that was never actually required. Think about the patterns that got passed down to you, the ones you can trace back through a parent or a grandparent without much effort at all. Maybe it was a fear of conflict. Maybe it was a habit of apologizing for taking up space. Maybe it was a belief that your own needs should always come last on the list, after everyone else's had already been met. Those patterns didn't arrive by accident. Somebody modeled them, usually without meaning to, usually while trying their best to raise you well by the only standards they knew. You get to be the generation that interrupts that pattern instead of passing it forward untouched. Not because the people before you failed, but because every generation gets the chance to keep what worked and set down what didn't, and very few people take that chance seriously until later in life, when they finally have the clarity and the courage to use it. Every time a grandchild watches you hold a boundary without shame, or say a true thing without flinching, or exist in a room without shrinking to fit into it, you are quietly rewriting a pattern that might otherwise have traveled forward untouched for another few generations. That's not a small contribution. That might be one of the largest ones available to you now. That's a legacy most people never think to leave on purpose. It doesn't show up in a will. Nobody reads it out loud at a funeral. But it lives on in the way a grandchild handles their own life 30 years from now, having quietly absorbed, from watching you, that their worth was never up for a vote in the first place. You may never know exactly how far that ripple travels, but it's traveling. Every time you choose honesty over performance, someone nearby is learning that it's possible. That's not a small thing you're doing. That's one of the most important things you'll ever do. And it started the moment you stopped needing anyone's permission to be exactly who you are. Remember that Tuesday from the beginning of this video, the ordinary day when you said no to something and didn't explain why, and didn't check anyone's face to see if it was the right answer? That moment wasn't an accident. It was the sum of everything we just talked about. Decades of learning to perform, followed by losses that stripped the performance away, followed by a slow, quiet reclaiming of your own voice. It didn't happen overnight, and if you're honest, it's probably still happening, one small decision at a time. You don't need their approval anymore. Not because you've stopped loving the people around you. You probably love them more clearly now, without the fog of trying to manage what they think of you. But because you've finally learned what took most of a lifetime to learn, that their approval was never actually required for your life to be worth living. It never kept you safe in the ways you thought it did. It never made you more loved than honesty does now. You don't have to announce this shift to anyone. You don't need a speech, a big declaration, a dramatic moment where you tell the people in your life that things are different now. Most of the time, it doesn't happen that way at all. It happens the way it happened for you on that ordinary Tuesday. Quietly, in a single small choice, one that nobody else even noticed was significant. And then it happens again, a little easier the second time. And again after that, easier still, until one day you look back and realize the performance simply isn't part of your life the way it used to be. You didn't have to force it to end. You just had to stop feeding it one honest moment at a time, and let it quietly run out of things to survive on. If any part of this felt like it was written about your life specifically, I'd love for you to stay a little longer. This channel exists for exactly this, for the kind of honest conversation about getting older that doesn't talk down to you, doesn't rush past the hard parts, and doesn't pretend that wisdom shows up all at once instead of slowly, the way it actually does. If you subscribe, it's not because this channel needs another number. It's because there are more conversations like this one waiting, and I'd genuinely like you to be here for them, not performing, not proving anything, just here exactly as you are. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Take care of yourself. You've earned the right to.